Japan once again placed its hopes on an upcoming naval confrontation, convinced it would be the decisive clash that could alter the war's course. Yet nearly 2 years had passed since Japanese carriers and battleships had sailed from their strongholds to threaten American forces. The powerful carriers and seasoned pilots that had once unleashed devastation at Pearl Harbor and in the early campaigns were now gone, sunk beneath the waves, leaving behind hastily built replacements manned by inexperienced sailors and flyers. More crippling still was the relentless American submarine campaign, which severed Japan's access to vital oil supplies. The nation's economy and navy alike were suffocating from fuel shortages, but Admiral Somu Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, remained determined to fight. By June 1944, the situation for Japan had grown dire. The British had broken the sieges at Imphal and Kohima, halting Japanese advances in Asia. In China, the front had turned into a grinding stalemate that consumed men and resources endlessly. Now the Americans were assembling a massive strike aimed at the Mariana Islands. This was not a token thrust, but a steel hammer. 15 aircraft carriers, 7 modern battleships, and 3 divisions of Marines prepared to descend on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. Japanese doctrine from as far back as the 1930s had envisioned this very area as the battleground where the fate of the Imperial Navy would be decided. Yet the old strategies, imagining vast lines of battleships trading blows in daylight duels, had been swept aside by the dominance of aircraft carriers and submarines. Toyoda knew that if there was to be any chance of success, he would have to commit his best ships, and so the first mobile fleet was formed under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a commander of great experience, though burdened by the weakness of the forces now under him. The Japanese attempted to gather this fleet at Tawi-Tawi, near Borneo's oil fields, in hopes of solving their fuel problem by positioning close to resources. But American submarines prowled the area constantly, tracking every movement and relaying detailed reports. These sightings alerted Admiral Raymond A. Spruance and the Pacific Fleet, yet they did not stop his advance. Spruance pressed on with his plans, directing his forces toward Saipan, which he ordered bombarded heavily by aircraft and naval guns before Marines stormed ashore on June 15th. Even as the landings began, the Japanese fleet was already at sea. On June 11th, Ozawa had led his force out, and it was a formidable-looking armada. At its heart were Yamato and Musashi, the largest and most powerful battleships in the world, armed with colossal 18-inch guns. Alongside them sailed Shokaku and Zuikaku, the fleet carriers that had delivered the first blows at Pearl Harbor. They were joined by Hyo and Junyo, converted from passenger liners Chitose and Chiyoda, once seaplane tenders, and the newer carrier Taiho, built with armored decks and improved protection after earlier lessons in damage control. It was this fleet that American submarines soon sighted. On June 15th, USS Flying Fish spotted their movement and sent word back, giving Spruance the signal. That battle was near. Unlike Midway, this time the odds favored the Americans heavily. 15 carriers faced Ozawa's 9. 7 battleships confronted 5. 21 cruisers were matched against 13, and 69 destroyers against 28. Even more decisive was air power. 891 carrier-based planes were ready to fly from American decks, compared to Ozawa's 430. Ozawa did have one potential advantage: about 400 land-based aircraft stationed on nearby islands such as Iwo Jima and Saipan, but whether they could be coordinated effectively remained doubtful. Still, despite serious shortages of fuel, lack of training, and declining equipment quality, this was the greatest naval force Japan would ever assemble in the war. Morale among its officers was outwardly high. Taiho, the pride of the fleet, with its armored flight deck and reinforced hull, was seen as invincible. Pilots believed they would smash the American carriers, and Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding the battleship division, confided in his diary that defeat seemed impossible. With such strength at hand, on the American side, Naval aviators also believed themselves to be a chosen elite. Among them was young George H.W. Bush, future U.S. President, then serving as a pilot on USS San Jacinto. These aviators had undergone some of the toughest training, programs imaginable, often lasting 2 years, taught by hardened veterans who shared the lessons of real combat. They practiced endlessly on converted training carriers, learning to master the perilous art of landing on pitching decks at sea. Although relatively few had yet faced combat, their preparation, combined with overwhelming numbers and superior aircraft, gave them a great advantage. The once feared Japanese Zero fighter was now outclassed by the rugged F-6F Hellcat. American TBM Avengers could handle the Japanese Jill torpedo bomber, and the proven SBD Dauntless was superior to the Japanese Judy dive bomber. As Ozawa pressed eastward, his fleet began to suffer even before battle was joined. American submarines attacked, sinking a destroyer and crippling supply ships. Japanese submarines sent ahead to scout were intercepted. U.S. destroyers listening to their transmissions hunted them down, sinking 17. The destroyer escort USS England alone accounted for 6 submarines in less than 2 weeks, a feat unmatched in the war. The attrition was punishing, yet Ozawa continued on course. Meanwhile, Marines fought fiercely on Saipan, and reconnaissance planes from both sides crisscrossed the skies south of Iwo Jima in search of the enemy's fleet. On his flagship Indianapolis, Spruance paced and weighed his decisions. He suspected Ozawa was attempting a lure, trying to draw the U.S. fleet west of Saipan and then strike the vulnerable transports and Marines ashore. Remembering the costly lessons of Guadalcanal, where U.S. troops had been left exposed when transports withdrew too soon, Spruance was determined not to abandon his ground forces. He resolved to force Ozawa to come to him, relying on superior radar, coordinated fighter direction, more powerful gunnery, and greater numbers of ships and planes to deliver victory. He instructed Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, leading the carrier task forces, and Vice Admiral Willis Lee, in charge of the battleships, that although they would handle their respective groups, he would keep tight overall control. Until then, the fleet would continue hammering Japanese airfields on Guam and Rota and remain close to Saipan. When the Japanese appeared, carrier aircraft would target their carriers first, then turn on battleships and cruisers, while the U.S. battle line would crush any enemy fleet that stood its ground, or mercilessly pursue and sink crippled ships in retreat. This cautious stance displeased Mitcher, who favored a preemptive strike, and many of his officers grumbled that Spruance, a battleship admiral by background, was too cautious for carrier warfare. Lee, however, while eager for combat, issued a caution of his own. Night engagements were too risky with green crews, and though radar offered advantages, communications difficulties and lack of training made night fleet actions too dangerous. On the night of June 18th, American codebreakers intercepted fresh orders sent from Ozawa to his bases in the Marianas, and radio direction finding placed his fleet 355 miles west-southwest of Spruance's position. Mitcher urged a night advance to close the distance and launch an attack at dawn. For an hour, Spruance and his staff debated, complicated by a conflicting submarine report suggesting the Japanese might be farther south and east. Concerned about being drawn into a trap, Spruance decided against moving west. He signaled Mitcher that the proposed maneuver was not advisable, noting that an enemy flanking attempt remained a real possibility. Mitcher's staff exploded with frustration. On Lexington, angry officers demanded more aggressive action, some even suggesting Spruance was timid. One officer bitterly wrote in his diary that the brass had lost their nerve, branding the admiral and the entire task force as cowards. Yet Spruance, confident in his decision, quietly went to bed after issuing his orders. Aboard the American carriers, however, there was no rest. On the hangar decks, crews armed aircraft with bombs and torpedoes preparing for the morning's sorties. At 3 a.m. on June 19th, the piercing notes of boatswain's pipes, bugle calls, gongs, and ship-wide announcements jolted sailors awake. General quarters was sounded throughout the fleet. Men sealed hatches, secured battle stations, fastened life vests and helmets, and readied themselves as the first light of dawn revealed calm seas and steady east winds, the beginning of a day that would decide the future of the Pacific. Under clear skies with nothing to hide, the Japanese scouts spotted Task Force 58 about 158 miles west-southwest of Saipan. The American formation was split into 3 carrier groups with escorts, while a battle line was deployed to shield the carrier's flight decks from surface fire by 16-inch guns and from air attack with 40mm and 20mm batteries. Ozawa depended on his long-range reconnaissance aircraft to locate the U.S. force, and on the 18th those scouts found it. Their range exceeded that of American search planes. Moving to strike, Ozawa sent his light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and others forward, with the super battles Yamato and Musashi in the van, while holding the heavier fleet carriers in the main body, a tactic the Japanese had used since Pearl Harbor. A decoy element to draw off American air strength, while the main force dealt the crushing blow. By 04:15 on the 19th, Ozawa had over 300 aircraft poised to hit the Americans, who still lacked his exact position. Tactically, the situation inverted midway. Then the U.S. had fewer ships but knew where the Japanese were. Now the Americans enjoyed overwhelming strength but did not yet know where Ozawa was. Yet the same man, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanded the U.S. side. At dawn, the Fifth Fleet steamed east into the wind so its carriers could launch aircraft periodically, zigzagging to hold station over Saipan. About 10:23, Spruance told Mitcher that if no enemy contacts appeared, they should be ready to strike Japanese bases on Rota and Guam, since Ozawa might dispatch planes there to refuel and rearm. Mitcher ordered fighter sweeps and combat air patrols over Guam and intercepted land-based raiders, American pilots claiming roughly 30 enemy fighters and 5 bombers. Early that morning, Ozawa sent up some 30 search aircraft. One of them located Mitcher's ships by 07:15, though 7 scouts were shot down by Cap. Undeterred, Ozawa's first strike formed up from his van, and at 08:30 launched 45 Zeros fitted as bombers, 8 Jill torpedo planes, and 16 escort Zeros, 69 aircraft in all. At 10:05, Alabama's radar picked up the incoming formation roughly 125 miles west, and at altitudes around 24,000 feet. Ozawa's strike had arrived on schedule, and ships not already at battle stations went to general quarters. Among those racing to their posts was Robert Feller, the former Major League pitching star now serving as gun captain of a quad 40mm mount on Alabama, who had chosen sea duty rather than the safety of shore to avoid special treatment. Mitcher began launching reserve fighters and recalled others from Guam with the old aviator's cry, "Hey, Rube!" And pilots scrambled from ready rooms, grabbed coffee, and jumped into the first available F-6F Hellcats. Guided by American fighter directors, the Hellcats closed. When the Japanese reached about 72 miles out, they began the circling maneuver their commanders ordered, a 15-minute procedure that gave the U.S. fighters their chance. Fighting 15 from Essex, led by Commander Charles W. Brewer, was among the first to engage. Brewer roared to his men on the radio, dove in, and tore the enemy formation apart. Firing at ranges as close as 800 feet and 400 feet, he set Zeros aflame and watched them plunge into the sea, ending the day with 4 confirmed victories. Planes from other squadrons, from Hornet, Princeton, Cabot, and Monterey, whose assistant navigator was the future President Gerald R. Ford, joined the onslaught, and American fighters and anti-aircraft batteries worked with brutal efficiency as contrails streaked the perfect sky. On Lexington, the leader of the fighter group compared the patterns overhead to commercial skywriting. Aboard other carriers, aces like Lieutenant Alex scrambled despite engine trouble and radio congestion, which for a time limited targets because the pilots below were doing such effective work. Mitchell also launched torpedo and dive bombers to keep enemy formations from reforming, and the remnants of Ozawa's raid, originally 169 planes, pressed on toward the American battleships and carriers after suffering losses. 6 aircraft had been lost at sea, others got disoriented and diverted to Guam, and many more were shot down in the dogfights. The U.S. battleships formed a ring with Indiana serving as a guide and Rear Admiral Lee directing operations from his usual flagship Washington. The surviving Japanese attackers aimed at South Dakota, a ship with a mixed wartime record that some sailors considered unlucky. Bombers dove on South Dakota and on escorting ships, and seaman accounts recorded a hellish scene of planes falling all around, bursting shells and giant sprays of water as bombs struck close by and aircraft crashed into the sea. American anti-aircraft. Crews, including Feller and his 25 men on the Quad 40, kept up an exhausting rate of fire for hours. They opened up at long range, maintained steady volleys, and watched twin-engine Betty bombers disintegrate under the barrage. On Washington, an officer later recalled that unlike the usual massed attacks from a single direction, these raids arrived piecemeal from every bearing, a sign the attackers had been badly mauled on the way in. The combat seemed unending as American. Fighters and gunners chased and shredded incoming planes. Not everything went right. One Japanese bomber scored a hit on South Dakota's forward superstructure with a 551-pound bomb, tearing a large hole, wrecking wiring and piping, damaging the captain's and admiral's quarters, putting a 40mm mount out of action and killing 27 men. Another tragic episode in that vessel's troubled combat history. South Dakota's bad fortune continued when the bomb that struck her forward superstructure killed 27 sailors outright and left 24 more wounded, wrecking wiring, pipes, and compartments while destroying an anti-aircraft mount. The gunners aboard claimed they had avenged their ship by blasting the attacker into the sea, yet Alabama's crews insisted the Japanese plane escaped. This disagreement only deepened the already simmering rivalry between the crews of the two battleships. Lieutenant J.D. Frederick R. Stylitz, flying an F-6F Hellcat from Saipan, called over the radio that he had destroyed one enemy plane and gave a hand signal for a second kill, but his own aircraft was badly damaged. Forced to ditch, he was seen, climbing into his raft, but he vanished into the Pacific and was never rescued. Such individual losses underscored the grim price being paid even in a battle that was overwhelmingly in the Americans' favor. The handful of Japanese bombers that managed to slip through the formidable American fighter screen and wall of flak achieved very little. One aircraft dropped a bomb close alongside the heavy cruiser Minneapolis, the near-miss rupturing fuel, and water pipes and sparking ablaze, but repair parties contained the damage. None of the raiders reached a U.S. carrier, the prime objective. By 10:57, radar controllers reported that the scopes were finally clear and the first strike had spent itself. Of the 69 Japanese planes that had taken off in the morning, only 27 limped back, 8 fighters, 13 fighter bombers, and 6 torpedo aircraft. The Americans had suffered the dead on South Dakota and 4 missing aviators, but their main force was untouched and ready for more action. Admiral Mitchell, recognizing that Ozawa's first blow could not have been the main effort, ordered his pilots to rearm and refuel. On the flight decks, blue-shirted crewmen patched up bullet holes, refilled magazines, and serviced engines while pilots, sweaty and exhausted, sipped coffee as they recounted their combats to intelligence officers. Overhead, torpedo squadrons and dive bombers orbited patiently, burning fuel as they awaited instructions, until eventually Mitchell dispatched Enterprise's torpedo bombers to search for the enemy fleet so that the rest could follow in to deliver. The counterstroke. Even before those scouts departed, the second Japanese wave was already on its way. Ozawa's Raid 2, launched a little after 8 in the morning, assembled 35 dive bombers, 27 torpedo bombers, and 48 fighters. As this mixed strike passed over Admiral Kakuta's van group, jittery Japanese anti-aircraft, Crews opened fire in error, shooting down 2 of their own planes and crippling several others, forcing them to turn back. The formation that pressed on was uneven, planes straggling and breaking into smaller groups, their discipline reflecting the dwindling experience and training of the air crews. Among them was Lieutenant T. Zenji Abe, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and Midway. He would later recall how fatigue left him so detached that he felt as though another hand guided his aircraft. Glancing around, he noticed that more and more of the formation had simply disappeared, perhaps turning back in despair, perhaps falling unseen into the ocean. When they finally reached the American fleet around 10:27, they were met by 12 Hellcats from Essex under Commander David McCampbell, an Alabama-born pilot whose calm confidence and striking looks belied the ferocity of his attack. McCampbell's fighters slashed into the enemy with speed, their .50 caliber guns tearing into the thinly armored bombers, many of which carried no self-sealing tanks, and erupted into fire with the first hits. Even before this clash, disaster had struck the Japanese fleet. From the decks of the carrier Taiho, the pride of Ozawa's force, planes had just begun to launch when one pilot, Warrant Officer Sakio Katsu, glimpsed a white wake cutting the sea toward his ship. In a gesture of desperate valor, he threw his plane into the path of the torpedo and perished in the explosion, saving his carrier from that single weapon. But the American submarine Albacore, under Commander Jim Blanchard, had already loosed a spread of 6 torpedoes from within the Japanese formation. Blanchard had stalked the enemy after being spotted and driven down by a Japanese scout at dawn, maneuvering into a rare firing position. One of his torpedoes struck home near Taiho's aviation fuel tanks. Though the damage at first seemed minor, the forward elevator jammed but no fires were reported. The blow had quietly ruptured fuel and oil lines, filling the carrier with explosive fumes. Blanchard and his crew, meanwhile, endured furious counterattacks by destroyers that pounded their submarine with depth charges, smashing light bulbs, flinging men from their bunks, and driving the vessel deep. Yet Albacore evaded destruction and crept clear by midday. Ozawa, unaware of the mortal wound his flagship had suffered, remained confident on the bridge. Above, McCampbell and his Hellcats were scattering the incoming raid. He downed multiple aircraft in rapid succession, flying repeated passes until his guns jammed, then cleared them and returned to the fray. By the end of the engagement, he had 5 confirmed victories and 1 probable, a single-day tally that secured his place among the top aces. He would ultimately finish the war with 34 kills, the Navy's leading scorer, his exploits celebrated nationwide. Other squadrons joined in, carving into the disordered Japanese groups. Pilots returned with planes riddled with holes yet survived, while enemy formations collapsed under relentless American gunnery. Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu, after clearing oil from his canopy, plunged back into combat, destroying 3 dive bombers in quick succession and then claiming more in the minutes that followed, including one enemy gunner who kept firing even as his stricken bomber fell burning into the ocean. Vratsiu's deadly efficiency epitomized the one-sided nature of the battle. By the time Raid 2 reached the American battle line, it too had been shattered, its survivors facing the disciplined coordination of radar operators, fighter directors, and anti-aircraft crews who filled the skies with lethal fire. The Japanese. Determination could not disguise the reality that their air arm was being ground to pieces in front of the carriers it had failed to harm. The Judy that had been targeted erupted in a tremendous fireball, its own bomb igniting and amplifying the destruction so violently that pieces of burning wreckage spun out in every direction. The pilot who had fired the fatal shots yanked his stick back hard to avoid the whirling debris and the glowing fragments raining around him, then calmly reported over the radio that he had splashed his 6th enemy of the day. With the immediate sky cleared of threats, he banked back toward Lexington, conserving what little ammunition he had left. As he rolled to a stop on the carrier's deck, he glanced up to see Admiral Mitcher observing from the flag bridge. Climbing out of the Cockpit with a broad grin, he proudly raised 6 fingers to display his tally. What made his feat even more remarkable was that he had destroyed 6 enemy aircraft using only 360 rounds of ammunition. A small crowd, led by the Admiral himself, greeted him warmly as the plane was secured, and Mitcher even requested a photograph for his personal files. That image, captured by a war correspondent, quickly spread across American newspapers as an emblem of triumph and resolve. By this point, the pilot had amassed 18 victories, and he would add another kill the following day. Both he and his wingman would survive the war, decorated for their valor, with the Navy Cross recognizing their courage. Other aviators from Lexington reported destroying a mix of enemy Judies, Jills, Kates, and Zeros without suffering losses, while Bunker Hill's fighters claimed fewer yet still contributed to the mounting tally. Observers compared the massacre to the ease of a turkey shoot back home, and that term would soon become the lasting label for the aerial battle now unfolding in the skies over the Philippine Sea. Among the enemy still pressing on was Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a seasoned veteran of earlier campaigns, including Pearl Harbor. Despite watching comrades shot from the sky and Hellcats tearing apart his formation, he kept flying alone at 13,000 feet until he reached striking distance of the American carriers. Lowering his nose, he committed to a dive-bombing run on Wasp. Though his bomb missed the ship, it detonated nearby, wounding 2 men and causing limited structural harm. Abe somehow pulled free from the curtain of anti-aircraft fire and the hunting American fighters, becoming the only Japanese pilot that day to actually release a bomb on a U.S. carrier and make it back alive. His survival was nothing short of miraculous. Moments later, 2 more Judies came out of the clouds and swung around Wasp's stern. Lookouts at first mistook them for friendlies until they dove into their attack runs. The carrier's guns blazed, joined by the fire of nearby ships, shredding one attacker, but the other managed to release its payload before being torn apart. The bomb struck close off the port beam, spraying lethal fragments that killed 1 sailor and wounded several more, before the enemy machine spiraled into the ocean, consumed by flames and smoke. Across the fleet, Japanese planes tried repeatedly to punch through. 4 torpedo bombers zeroed in on Enterprise and Princeton, but anti-aircraft fire ripped them from the sky before they could deliver effective strikes. Officers on the bridges described the extraordinary spectacle of dozens of Japanese planes tumbling earthward, some exploding into dazzling fireballs that glowed even in the bright daylight, others trailing thick black smoke before slamming into the sea. The sheer volume of destruction made counting impossible. For long minutes, white contrails carved graceful arcs and loops across the blue sky, each one marking the frantic maneuvers of aircraft fighting for their lives. From Yorktown, Commander Smoke Streen led 10 Hellcats into a furious clash, diving from 24,000 feet into the melee. His fighters smashed into the Japanese formations with relentless aggression, splashing dozens of planes in quick succession, including 34 fighters and 3 bombers by the end of the day. Lieutenant R.A. Shryan Jr. led his own division, from 20,000 feet into a chaotic dogfight far below, downing a Zero in a high-speed pass before watching it spiral helplessly into the waves. Another pilot, Lieutenant J.J. Staley, spotted a Judy diving toward the fleet at 5,000 feet and fired into its nose until the bomber rolled onto its back and crashed into the sea. Yet despite the overwhelming superiority of American pilots, a handful of Japanese aircraft still managed to slip through. Stockham, a picket destroyer screening the fleet, endured wave after wave of determined enemy attacks for 20 minutes. As bombers came at her from all directions. Remarkably, she emerged unscathed, her own guns and supporting fighters knocking down plane after plane before they could deliver a hit. Lieutenant William Lamb of Princeton's VF-27 squadron found himself suddenly surrounded by a dozen Jills over Stockham. With only 1 of his 6 machine guns functioning, he stayed carefully out of range until reinforcements arrived, then dove in with deadly precision, shooting down 3 attackers with that single weapon. Enterprise's famed Grim Reapers also earned their place in the battle, charging into enemy planes, threatening battleships, and setting attackers ablaze before they could release torpedoes. Some Jills managed to launch, but their weapons either missed or detonated harmlessly in the water, while others were obliterated in mid-air by bursts of American gunfire. The battleships themselves absorbed repeated threats with minimal damage. South Dakota and Alabama again drew the attention of torpedo bombers, but their combined gunners drove them off. One Judy attempted a bombing run on Alabama during the distraction but missed entirely, while Indiana accounted for multiple kills. One torpedo aimed at Indiana exploded only 50 yards away, shaking but not harming her, while another Japanese plane lacking a torpedo slammed into her hull and immediately sank with negligible effect. On San Francisco, even a small wound suffered by a gun officer, likely from friendly shrapnel, was met with a shout to his crew to redouble their fire, urging them to avenge the injury and tear the enemy from the skies. Still, the Japanese pressed toward the carriers. Enterprise and Princeton drew further attention as enemy bombers dove in. A Judy, caught in a torrent of fire, wobbled away without dropping its bomb before spiraling into the sea. Jills attempted torpedo runs, but most were blown apart by the combined fire of escorts. One dropped a torpedo toward Enterprise moments before heavy shells tore off its wing, sending it vertically into the water where its weapon exploded harmlessly. At 12:30 p.m., two Judys burst from a cloud above Bunker Hill, one being shredded in mid-air, while the other managed to release a bomb that rocked the carrier, wrecking one elevator, igniting fires, damaging fuel lines, and killing and wounding nearly 30 men. Yet the disciplined damage control crews immediately contained the blazes and stabilized the ship, ensuring she remained in action. By noon, radar screens were finally empty. The furious aerial struggle of the Mao Day's second raid complete. Only fragments of Ozawa's once formidable force remained, with just a handful of Zeros, Judys, and Jills straggling back toward their distant carriers. Out of 128 planes launched, barely 30 managed to return. The waters around the American fleet were stained with oil slicks and dotted with wreckage, the last traces of the hundreds of Japanese aviators who would never return. For Admiral Ozawa, worse still lay ahead. Even as Taiho's crew battled the creeping disaster of fuel vapor spreading through her compartments from an earlier torpedo hit, another American submarine was closing in on his battered fleet. Kavala, commanded by Hermann Kostler on his first patrol as skipper, had stalked the Japanese force through the night. Seizing the perfect angle on Shokaku, he launched a spread of torpedoes before diving deep as destroyers closed in with depth charges. 3 weapons struck home, ripping into the carrier's hull. Shokaku shuddered, slowed, and fell out of formation, fires raging across her decks as aviation fuel poured through ruptured lines. Her crew fought valiantly to save her, but secondary explosions ignited by gasoline fumes and oil sealed her fate. By mid-afternoon, she was breaking apart, magazines detonating in massive fireballs before sliding beneath the waves with over 1,000 men. From deep below, Kavala's crew heard the thunder of her death and radioed their success back to headquarters, earning the praise of Admiral Lockwood and eventually a presidential unit citation. With Taiho fatally compromised by fumes and Shokaku gone entirely, Ozawa's fleet had already been dealt catastrophic blows. Yet despite losing hundreds of planes, one carrier sunk and another stricken, he had not called off his efforts. At the same time, Admiral Spruance, having endured the morning and afternoon onslaughts with minimal losses, still held back the immense striking power of his carriers, ready to unleash them when the moment came.